It was the summer of 2012, and I had just turned 25. My Uncle Carl, his stepsister Linda, and I decided to go camping deep in the Ozarks. Uncle Carl was a retired military man, strong and resourceful, and Linda, though not related to me by blood, had a reputation for being tough and adventurous. I figured I was in good hands. We packed up the truck with all the essentials: a couple of tents, a cooler filled with food, water, flashlights, and a shotgun that Uncle Carl insisted on bringing, just in case. I didn't think much of it at the time. He always liked to be prepared. The campsite was about a 5-hour drive from where we lived. It wasn't a designated campground, but rather a secluded spot Carl had scouted a few years back. He liked places where no one else would bother us, where the trees stood tall, and the only sounds were the rustle of leaves and the distant calls of wildlife. We arrived just as the sun began to set. The road leading to the site was little more than a dirt trail, and the truck bounced and jolted over rocks and potholes. When we finally reached the clearing, it was almost dark. The air was thick with the smell of pine and damp earth. Carl and Linda set to work pitching the tents while I gathered wood for a fire. By the time everything was set up, the night had fully taken over. The stars above were brilliant, their light unimpeded by city smog. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the trees around us. We ate a simple dinner of canned beans and hot dogs. Carl told a few stories about his time in the military, mostly funny or harmless anecdotes. Linda chimed in with tales of her hiking adventures. It was a peaceful evening, and I was beginning to relax, enjoying the break from the noise and chaos of everyday life. Around midnight, we decided to turn in. Carl insisted on keeping the shotgun loaded and within reach, just in case of bears. I wasn't thrilled about the idea of sleeping in the open woods, but I trusted him. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night to a strange noise. It was faint, almost like a whistle, but distorted, like someone was trying to imitate a bird but wasn't quite getting it right. I lay still, listening. Came again, this time from a different direction. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a bird or a coyote, but then I noticed something else. The woods were completely silent. No crickets, no owls, nothing. It was as if the forest was holding its breath. I tried to shake it off and go back to sleep, but the uneasy feeling lingered. When I woke up, Carl and Linda were already up, making coffee over the fire. I mentioned the strange noise, but Carl shrugged it off. Probably just a fox or something, he said. Linda agreed, but I could tell she wasn't entirely convinced. We decided to go for a hike that day, following a trail Carl had mapped out. It was a beautiful path, winding through dense trees and crossing a small stream. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. At one point, Linda stopped and pointed out something on the ground. It was a boot print, large and fresh. "Looks like someone's been through here," Carl said, frowning. "Could be a hunter." But we hadn't seen or heard anyone else since we'd arrived. That evening, back at camp, I was gathering more firewood when I stumbled upon something strange. Tucked behind a cluster of bushes was a small pile of objects. A torn piece of fabric, a broken knife handle, and what looked like an old, weathered notebook. The notebook was damp and falling apart, but I could make out a few scribbled words. "They're watching. Don't stay." I felt a chill run down my spine. I showed it to Carl and Linda. Carl's face darkened as he examined the items. "Could be someone messing with us," he said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. We decided not to let it ruin our trip. Carl threw the notebook into the fire and told us to stay close. That night was worse. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of footsteps, soft, deliberate, and circling the campsite. I froze, listening as they moved closer, then stopped. Carl must have heard it too because I heard him cock the shotgun. Linda whispered something, but I couldn't make it out. Suddenly, there was a loud crash, like someone or something had thrown a heavy rock at the truck. Carl sprang into action, shouting as he fired the shotgun into the air. The footsteps retreated, but the silence that followed was even more unnerving. At first light, we decided to pack up and leave. None of us wanted to admit it, but we were scared. As we loaded the truck, we found deep scratches on the side of the vehicle, long, jagged marks that couldn't have been made by any animal I knew of. The drive back was tense. None of us spoke much. We kept checking the rearview mirrors, half expecting to see something or someone following us. When we got home, Carl reported the incident to the local authorities. They said they'd look into it, but I never heard anything more about it. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there, but sometimes, late at night, I think back to that notebook and its warning, "They're watching, don't stay." And I wonder if we were lucky to leave when we did, or if we left too late. It was a cold October evening, and the rain had been coming down steadily since late afternoon. My team and I were deep in the Appalachian wilderness for a 3-day camping trip. The plan was simple: bond as a group, push through challenging terrain, and enjoy the isolation of the forest. It was 2022, and I was 28 years old, fresh out of my desk job, trying to shake the monotony of daily life. My team consisted of 4 others: Matt, a seasoned hiker in his mid-30s, Sarah, a no-nonsense survivalist in her early 40s, Liam, a photographer capturing the experience for his portfolio, and Carla, a fitness enthusiast with energy levels that made the rest of us feel like slugs. We had set up camp in a clearing surrounded by towering pines and a few oaks. The location was remote, miles away from any trailhead, and we hadn't seen another soul since entering the forest 2 days ago. The rain added an eerie charm to the woods. Everything looked darker and closer, the sound of raindrops blending with the rustling of leaves and occasional distant thunder. The smell of damp earth and wet pine filled the air. The tent I shared with Liam felt cramped but warm, the constant pitter-patter of rain on the fabric providing a strange sense of comfort. After dinner, a mix of dehydrated meals and energy bars, we huddled under the tarp to discuss the next day's plan. The rain made a fire impossible, so we used lanterns that cast long, flickering shadows on the surrounding trees. Eventually, the cold seeped into our bones, and we all retreated to our tents. Lying in my sleeping bag, I tried to drift off, but something felt off. The forest was loud in a way that wasn't normal. The rain masked smaller sounds, but there were occasional rustles and snaps that seemed too deliberate to be natural. I told myself it was just the wind or an animal, but my mind wouldn't let go of the unease. At one point, Liam shifted in his sleep, and the sound startled me. I cursed myself for being jumpy and rolled onto my side, facing the tent wall. The lantern outside cast a faint glow, enough to see shadows of the branches above swaying in the wind. I closed my eyes and forced myself to relax. Then I heard it, a faint crunch, like someone stepping on wet leaves. My eyes snapped open. I strained to listen, holding my breath. Another crunch, closer this time. My heart started pounding. Probably just a deer, I thought, but it didn't sit right. The steps were too slow and deliberate. Animals didn't move like that. I sat up, trying not to make any noise, and glanced at Liam. He was still asleep, oblivious. I debated waking him up, but decided against it. Instead, I unzipped the tent flap just enough to peek outside. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and the forest was cloaked in mist. The lantern was still glowing, but it barely illuminated the surrounding trees. I scanned the area, seeing nothing out of the ordinary. The crunching stopped. The only sounds were the rain and the occasional groan of the trees swaying in the wind. I told myself I was being paranoid and zipped the tent back up. It wasn't long before I started dozing off again, But the peace didn't last. A loud snap jolted me awake. This time it wasn't just me. Liam stirred too, muttering something incoherent. I sat up, heart racing, and listened. The sound came again, closer, a branch breaking underfoot. Liam groggily asked what was wrong, and I whispered for him to be quiet. I gestured toward the tent flap, and he seemed to catch on. Slowly, he reached for his flashlight and handed it to me. I hesitated, then unzipped the flap just enough to shine the beam outside. The light cut through the mist, revealing the clearing and the surrounding trees. At first, I saw nothing, just the empty space where our gear was stored under the tarp. But then, at the edge of the light, something moved, a figure partially obscured by the trees. My breath caught in my throat. It was definitely a person, standing perfectly still, watching our camp. They were too far to make out any details, but the shape was unmistakable. I froze, unsure of what to do. Should I wake the others? Should I confront the figure? My mind raced through the possibilities. Then the figure moved again, stepping back into the darkness. I kept the flashlight trained on the spot, but they were gone. Liam whispered, asking what I saw, but I couldn't find the words. All I could do was sit there, gripping the flashlight, my heart pounding in my chest. I finally decided to wake the others. Quietly, I slipped out of the tent and moved to Sarah and Matt's tent. I tapped on the fabric, whispering their names. Sarah was the first to emerge, her face serious and alert. Matt followed, looking groggy but concerned. I quickly explained what I had seen, and they didn't hesitate to believe me. Sarah took charge, suggesting we stay together and keep the lanterns and flashlights on. She grabbed a hunting knife from her pack, while Matt armed himself with a heavy walking stick. Carla joined us shortly after, her usual energy replaced with a quiet determination. We stood in a tight circle, scanning the forest for any signs of movement. The rain had stopped completely, and the silence was oppressive. Every small sound seemed magnified. The creak of a branch, the drip of water from the leaves, the crunch of our boots on the wet ground. We decided to check the perimeter of our camp, staying close together. As we moved toward the edge of the clearing, I noticed something strange. Footprints in the mud. They were fresh, leading from the trees to the center of our camp and back out again. The size suggested an adult wearing boots. Following the tracks, we found more signs of intrusion. A few of our supplies had been moved. Nothing was taken, but it was clear someone had rummaged through our gear. A chill ran down my spine. Whoever it was had been bold enough to enter our camp while we were sleeping. We decided to pack up and leave immediately. The idea of staying another night with a potential intruder nearby was too risky. As we hurried to gather our things, the sense of being watched grew stronger. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure lurking in the shadows. The hike back to the trailhead was grueling. The rain had turned the paths into a slippery mess, and the darkness made every step treacherous. We moved quickly, our flashlights cutting through the mist, the forest seeming to close in around us. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps behind us, but when I turned, there was nothing. The others heard it too, their eyes darting nervously toward the trees. We didn't stop to investigate. Hours later, just as the first light of dawn began to creep through the trees, we finally reached the trailhead. Exhausted and shaken, we piled into the cars without saying much. The relief of leaving the forest was overwhelming, but the unease lingered. It wasn't until we were back in civilization that we allowed ourselves to talk about what had happened. Sarah suggested it might have been a local hunter or a lost hiker, but the deliberate movements and the way they watched us didn't add up. Matt speculated it could have been someone trying to scare us off, but why? Weeks later, Liam sent me a photo he had taken during the trip. It was a wide shot of our camp at dusk, the forest stretching out in the background. At first, it looked like any other photo, but then I noticed it. In the shadows near the edge of the frame, a figure standing among the trees watching us. It was the summer of 2023, and I was 27 at the time. My friends and I had planned a camping trip deep in the Rockies, far from the usual crowded spots. We all wanted to escape the noise of city life and enjoy the wilderness for a few days. The group consisted of 4 of us. James, an experienced outdoorsman who took the lead on everything. Emily, who had just gotten into hiking but was eager to prove herself. Chris, our tech-savvy friend with a knack for finding the best trails. And me, someone who loved the outdoors but didn't have as much experience as the others. We parked the car at a remote trailhead and hiked in about 6 miles before setting up camp. The spot we picked was a small clearing surrounded by towering pines and rugged terrain. A creek ran nearby, providing us with water and a soothing background noise. The area felt untouched, wild, and completely isolated. It was perfect. The first day was uneventful. We set up our tents, gathered firewood, and spent the evening around the fire, eating and chatting about life. The air was crisp, the sky clear, and the stars brighter than I had ever seen. It felt good to be disconnected from the world. By the time we turned in for the night, exhaustion had set in. The hike had been long, and the cool night air made it easy to fall asleep. I shared a tent with Chris while James and Emily bunked together in another. The fire burned down to embers as we settled into our sleeping bags. I woke up in the middle of the night to a faint noise outside. It was a rustling sound, like something moving through the underbrush. At first, I thought it might be the wind, but it didn't quite match. The sound had a deliberate rhythm to it, almost like footsteps. I stayed still, listening intently, my heart starting to race. It wasn't uncommon for animals to wander near campsites, and I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe a raccoon. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The rustling stopped, and after a few minutes of silence, I managed to drift back to sleep. The next morning, I mentioned the noise to the group. James shrugged it off, saying it was likely just an animal. Emily and Chris agreed, and we went about our day, hiking further into the wilderness and exploring the area. The scenery was breathtaking. Rocky ridges, lush meadows, and a waterfall we stumbled upon by chance. It was everything we had hoped for. That night, things started to feel different. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest seemed to change. The sounds of birds and insects faded, replaced by an unsettling quiet. Even the creek seemed quieter, its babbling softer and less constant. We sat around the fire again, but the mood was more subdued. James tried to lighten the atmosphere by cracking jokes, but it felt forced. I couldn't shake the unease I'd felt the night before, and I wasn't the only one. Emily kept glancing over her shoulder, and Chris seemed distracted, his usual chatter replaced by silence. When it came time to sleep, I felt reluctant to crawl into my tent. The fire was still burning, casting flickering shadows on the trees around us. I wanted to stay by its warmth and light, but exhaustion won out. I crawled into my sleeping bag, telling myself I was overthinking things. I woke up again, this time to a much louder noise. It was the sound of something snapping, a branch maybe. My eyes flew open, and I lay there, holding my breath. Chris was still asleep beside me, his breathing steady. I listened, straining to catch any sound over the pounding of my heart. There it was again, a distinct crunch like a footstep on dry leaves. It was close, too close. I glanced at the tent wall, illuminated faintly by the dying fire outside. A shadow passed across it, quick and deliberate. My stomach dropped. Someone was out there. I froze, unsure of what to do. My mind raced through possibilities. Was it another camper? A lost hiker? But what were the chances of someone else being out here, miles from the nearest trailhead, without us knowing? And why would they be sneaking around our campsite in the middle of the night? I stayed as still as possible, listening. The footsteps moved slowly around the tent, circling it. At one point, they stopped, and I swear I could hear breathing. I clenched my fists, trying to keep calm, but my heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. Eventually, the steps moved away, fading into the forest. I waited, not daring to move, until the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees. When I finally emerged from the tent, the others were already awake, their faces pale and tense. They had heard it too. We searched the area, looking for any signs of what or who had been there. It didn't take long to find the footprints. They were fresh, unmistakable, and human. The tracks circled our tents before leading off into the woods. James followed the trail a short distance before stopping abruptly. He called us over, his face grim. The footprints ended at a tree, where we found something even more unsettling. A piece of torn fabric snagged on a low branch. It was dark green, like the kind of jacket someone might wear while hiking. But there was no sign of the person who left it. We debated what to do. James wanted to pack up and leave immediately, but Chris argued that it could have been a harmless passerby. Emily and I were torn, but the unease was growing stronger by the minute. In the end, we decided to stay one more night, reasoning that whoever it was had likely moved on. That evening, we built the biggest fire we could and kept our flashlights and a hatchet within arm's reach. The forest felt even more oppressive, the silence heavier than ever. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves set us on edge. As the hours passed, we took turns keeping watch. I volunteered for the first shift, sitting by the fire with the hatchet in my lap. The minutes dragged by, every shadow and sound amplified by my fraying nerves. The others tried to sleep, but I could tell they were restless. It was during Chris's shift that it happened. I was half asleep when I heard him whisper my name, urgency in his voice. I sat up, instantly alert. He gestured toward the edge of the clearing, where the light from the fire faded into darkness. There, just beyond the reach of the flames, was a figure. They stood completely still, watching us. My blood ran cold. Chris and I locked eyes, and I could see the fear mirrored in his face. We didn't move, didn't make a sound. The figure lingered for what felt like an eternity before slowly backing away into the trees. That was it. We woke the others and packed up in record time, not caring about the darkness or the difficulty of navigating the trail at night. The only goal was to get as far away as possible. We moved quickly, our flashlights cutting through the blackness, every sound making us jump. The hike back was a blur of fear and exhaustion. At one point, Emily tripped and scraped her knee, but she barely reacted, too focused on getting out. The miles seemed endless, the forest closing in around us. Every so often, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure following us. When we finally reached the car, the relief was overwhelming. We threw our gear into the trunk and piled in, locking the doors. James started the engine and we sped off without looking back. Back in town, we reported the incident to the local authorities. They took our statement but didn't seem overly concerned. The officer we spoke to suggested it might have been a hermit or someone living off the grid, though that didn't explain the deliberate way they had circled our camp or watched us from the shadows. Weeks later, I couldn't stop thinking about the encounter. I replayed it in my mind, trying to make sense of it, but the truth was simple. Someone had been out there with us, someone who didn't want to be seen but made sure we knew they were there. I haven't been camping since. The year was 2010, and I had just been deployed on my third mission overseas. At 29 years old, I wasn't new to the military life. I'd seen my fair share of action and thought I was ready for just about anything. I was wrong. We were stationed in a remote part of Eastern Europe, somewhere along the border of Ukraine and Belarus. The mission was simple, or so we were told. A high-value target, HVT, was rumored to be hiding in a heavily forested region, using an abandoned logging camp as a base of operations. Intelligence suggested he was a former mercenary-turned-arms dealer, now working with local militant groups. Our task was to locate and eliminate him before he could supply weapons to hostile forces. There were 6 of us in the unit, led by a seasoned officer we called Sarge. He'd been in the military for over 2 decades and had seen combat in places I couldn't even pronounce. If anyone could lead us through this, it was him. We set out at dawn, moving through dense forest terrain. The air was cold and damp, and the only sounds were our boots crunching on the frosty ground and the distant calls of birds. It was the kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl, like the forest itself was holding its breath. After about 4 hours of trekking, we came across the old logging camp. It was exactly how Intel described it. Run-down cabins, rusting machinery, and an eerie sense of abandonment. The place looked like it hadn't seen life in years. We spread out, sweeping the area for any signs of activity. My job was to secure the perimeter, keeping watch for any movement while the others searched the buildings. I crouched behind a stack of old lumber, scanning the tree line with my rifle. Every shadow felt like a threat, every sound like a warning. It wasn't long before Sarge called us all together. He'd found something, a set of fresh tire tracks leading deeper into the woods. They were too fresh to be anything but our target. We followed them, moving in a single-file formation. The deeper we went, the more unsettling the forest became. The trees grew thicker, their branches weaving together to block out the sun. The air felt heavier, like we were being swallowed whole. After about an hour of tracking, we stumbled upon a small clearing. In the center was a makeshift campsite, a fire pit, a couple of tents, and some scattered supplies. It looked hastily abandoned, like whoever had been here left in a hurry. Sarge signaled for us to spread out and investigate. I moved toward one of the tents, my rifle at the ready. The flap was open, and inside I found a few basic supplies. A map, some canned food, and a hunting knife. Nothing out of the ordinary, but it was clear someone had been here recently. That's when I noticed something. Near the edge of the clearing, half buried in the dirt, was a boot print. It was larger than any of ours and pointed toward the trees. I called Sarge over, and he nodded grimly. We were on the right track, but something about the print bothered me. It was deep, like whoever made it was carrying a heavy load. And there were no other prints nearby, no sign of movement in or out of the clearing. It was as if the person had appeared out of thin air. We didn't have time to dwell on it. Sarge ordered us to follow the trail, and we moved out, our senses on high alert. The forest seemed even quieter now, as if the trees themselves were watching us. About half an hour later, we found ourselves in another clearing. This one was larger, with an old hunting cabin in the center. The cabin was in bad shape, its roof caved in and its walls covered in moss. But it wasn't the cabin that caught my attention. It was the figure standing in front of it. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a black jacket and cargo pants. His face was obscured by a balaclava, and he held a rifle slung over his shoulder. He didn't move, didn't react to our presence. He just stood there, staring at us. Sarge signaled for us to fan out, rifles trained on the figure. But before we could make a move, a shot rang out. Came from somewhere in the trees, and one of our guys, Parker, went down. The figure in front of the cabin disappeared into the shadows, and all hell broke loose. We scattered, taking cover behind whatever we could find. Bullets whizzed past me, splintering trees and kicking up dirt. I returned fire, but I couldn't see our attackers. They were ghosts using the dense forest to their advantage. Sarge barked orders, trying to regain control of the situation. We managed to regroup behind a fallen tree, but we'd already lost 2 men, Parker and Collins. Their bodies lay crumpled in the dirt, blood pooling beneath them. "We need to move," Sarge said, his voice low but urgent. We abandoned the hunt for the HVT and focused on getting out alive. But the forest seemed to work against us, twisting and turning until we didn't know which way was which. The gunfire had stopped, but we knew they were still out there, watching us. As night fell, we found ourselves back at the first campsite. It didn't make sense. We'd been moving in the opposite direction. It was as if the forest had led us in circles. That's when we saw it. The fire pit, which had been cold and empty before, was now lit. Flames danced in the darkness, casting eerie shadows on the trees. And around the fire were figures. 5 of them, all dressed in black, their faces hidden. They didn't move, didn't react to our presence. They just stood there watching us. Sarge ordered us to open fire, but as soon as we pulled the triggers, the figures vanished. The fire went out, plunging us into darkness. Panic set in. We ran, not caring which direction, just wanting to get away. The forest seemed alive, the trees closing in around us. Every step felt like a struggle, the air thick and suffocating. We finally broke through the tree line and found ourselves on a dirt road. A military convoy was waiting for us, their headlights cutting through the darkness. We stumbled toward them, exhausted and terrified. But when we reached the convoy, we realized something was wrong. The vehicles were empty, their engines cold. And on the hood of one of the trucks was a single message, scrawled in blood: "You are not welcome here." We never spoke about what happened that night. The official report said the mission was a failure, and the HVT was never found. But we knew the truth. Something was out there, something that didn't want us in those woods. And it was still out there, waiting for anyone foolish enough to enter its domain. I left the military a year later, unable to shake the memories of that mission. I moved to a quiet town, far from any forests. But every now and then, I catch myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see those figures standing in the shadows. And every time I do, I remember the words on the truck: "You are not welcome here." It was the summer of 2016 when my cousin David, a scientist, convinced me to join him on a camping trip in the dense forests of northern Montana. David was brilliant but eccentric, always obsessed with his work. His focus was environmental science, and he had been working on studying ecosystems untouched by human interference. This trip, however, wasn't just for his research, it was personal. He claimed he needed a control environment for an experiment he had been working on for months. I was hesitant at first. Camping wasn't really my thing, and David's experiments often involved complex equipment and jargon I couldn't begin to understand. But he insisted, saying it would be a chance for us to reconnect after years of drifting apart. Plus, he needed someone he could trust, and apparently I fit the bill. We drove up in his old Jeep, loaded with camping gear, food, and a mysterious black case that he refused to let out of his sight. He had booked a remote site near the Canadian border, miles from the nearest town. As we bumped along the dirt road leading into the wilderness, I couldn't help but feel uneasy. The trees seemed taller, darker, and denser than any I'd ever seen. When we finally arrived, the sun was already low in the sky. David picked a spot near a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. He wasted no time setting up camp, and I followed his lead. By nightfall, we had a tent pitched, a small fire crackling, and his equipment unpacked. That's when David finally explained his experiment. He had developed a device that, in theory, could measure changes in air quality, soil composition, and other environmental factors in real time. He wanted to test it in an untouched area to see if it could detect even the subtlest shifts caused by natural events or human interference. It sounded harmless enough, though I didn't fully grasp the implications. As the firelight flickered, David calibrated his device, which looked like a sleek, black box with an array of sensors and blinking lights. He placed it about 20 feet from the tent, assuring me it needed to be in an open area for accurate readings. Then we settled in for the night, the sounds of the forest lulling us to sleep. The next morning, David was already up, staring intently at the data on his laptop. He seemed excited, mumbling something about anomalies in the readings. I shrugged it off and focused on making coffee. But as the day wore on, his mood shifted. He became restless, checking the device every few minutes and scribbling notes furiously in his journal. "What's going on?" I finally asked. "I'm not sure," he replied, avoiding eye contact. By the afternoon, the tension was palpable. David decided to hike deeper into the forest to place additional sensors. I followed reluctantly, not thrilled about venturing further into the wilderness. As we walked, the forest grew even more oppressive. The air felt heavy, and an unnatural silence settled around us. David stopped suddenly and crouched down to examine the ground. He pointed out strange marks in the soil, like something had been dragged through the underbrush. They didn't look like animal tracks or anything I could recognize. We pressed on, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Shadows seemed to move in the corners of my vision, and the occasional rustle of leaves made my heart race. David, however, was laser-focused on his work, setting up his sensors and jotting down more notes. By the time we returned to camp, the sun was setting. David reviewed the data again, his face a mask of confusion and concern. "There's something out there," he muttered, more to himself than to me. That night, I barely slept. The forest seemed alive with noise, branches snapping, leaves rustling, and faint, distant sounds that didn't belong to any animal I knew. Around 3 a.m., I heard it, a low, rhythmic hum that seemed to vibrate through the ground. I sat up, heart pounding, and saw David staring at his laptop, pale and wide-eyed. The device outside was glowing faintly, the lights pulsating in a pattern that didn't seem random. "Is it broken?" I whispered. David shook his head. "It's picking up something unusual." The following morning, David was adamant about investigating further. He insisted we hike to a nearby ridge to get a better view of the area. Reluctantly, I agreed, though every instinct told me to pack up and leave. The hike was grueling, the terrain steep and uneven. As we climbed, the hum returned, faint but persistent. It grew louder the higher we went, and by the time we reached the ridge, it was almost deafening. From the top, we could see the vast forest stretching out for miles, but something caught my eye, a clearing about a mile away. The trees around it were charred and blackened, as if by fire, but there was no smoke or sign of recent burning. David's face lit up with a mix of fear and excitement. "We need to get down there," he said. The trek to the clearing was the most terrifying experience of my life. The hum grew louder with every step, resonating in my chest like a second heartbeat. The forest around us seemed to close in. The trees twisted and gnarled as if warped by some unseen force. When we finally reached the clearing, I froze. The ground was scorched, the air thick with a metallic tang. In the center was a massive, jagged hole, as if the earth had been torn apart. The device in David's hand went haywire, the lights flashing erratically. This isn't natural," he stammered. Before I could respond, the ground beneath us began to tremble. A deep, guttural sound emanated from the hole, and a rush of hot air sent us stumbling back. "Run!" David yelled, but I was already moving. We sprinted back toward camp, the hum now a roar that drowned out everything else. When we reached the tent, David grabbed his laptop and the black case, shouting that we needed to leave immediately. The drive out of the forest was a blur. David wouldn't speak, his face pale and eyes darting nervously. Even after we reached the highway, the hum seemed to linger in my ears, like an unwelcome reminder. A few weeks later, I tried to contact David, but he wouldn't return my calls. When I finally managed to visit him, he was a shadow of his former self. Gaunt, paranoid, and obsessed with the data he had collected. He showed me his findings, but they made no sense, patterns, numbers, and readings that defied explanation. "It's bigger than us," he said, his voice trembling. That was the last time I saw him. A month later, David disappeared. His apartment was empty, his research gone. To this day, I don't know what we found in that forest. But sometimes, late at night, I hear that hum, faint but unmistakable. It's a sound I'll never forget, a reminder of something out there, hidden and waiting. It was late September 2021 when I decided to take a camping trip to clear my head. I'd been under a lot of stress at work, and the thought of getting away from the city sounded like the perfect remedy. I wasn't a stranger to camping, but this time, I wanted something different. Somewhere remote, quiet, and untouched by the crowds. After some research, I found a place deep in northern Montana, near the edge of an abandoned mining site. It was tucked far away from any major towns and surrounded by dense forests. It seemed perfect. I loaded my truck with supplies: a sturdy tent, sleeping bag, food for 3 days, a couple of knives, a first aid kit, and a GPS device. I also brought along a journal to jot down thoughts, thinking it might help me unwind. I didn't tell many people where I was going, just my brother, Mark, and a coworker in passing. "Just heading up north for some alone time," I had said. The drive up was long and quiet, the kind of road trip where you rarely see another car. By the time I reached the dirt path leading to the camping area, the sun had started to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows through the trees. My GPS had stopped working about 20 minutes earlier, but I had printed a map just in case. I followed the rough path until I found a clearing. It was surrounded by towering pines and just a stone's throw away from what I assumed was the abandoned mining site. Rusted equipment and collapsed wooden structures peeked out from the overgrowth. I set up camp quickly, pitching my tent in the center of the clearing. The air was crisp, and the only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant chirps of crickets. After eating a quick meal of canned soup, I sat by a small fire, staring into the flames and letting the stillness of the place wash over me. As the night deepened, an unease began to settle in. It wasn't anything obvious, just a feeling, like I was being watched. I chalked it up to being alone in an unfamiliar place and crawled into my tent. The first night was mostly uneventful. I woke up once to the sound of something moving outside the tent, but it was faint and didn't last long. Probably just a raccoon or deer. The next morning, I decided to explore the area. The remnants of the mining site intrigued me. As I walked through the overgrown paths, I saw rusted tools, shattered glass bottles, and even a few collapsed mine entrances. Some of the shafts were fenced off, but others were wide open, dark holes leading into the earth. One particular mine caught my attention. It was larger than the others and had what looked like fresh tracks leading into it, like someone had dragged something heavy through the dirt. I stood there for a while, debating whether to go inside, but ultimately decided against it. The last thing I needed was to fall into some hole and get stuck miles from help. As I turned to head back to camp, I noticed something odd. The trees on one side of the clearing had markings on them, slashes like someone had taken a knife or axe and hacked into the bark. They were deep and deliberate, running horizontally across several trees. I couldn't figure out why anyone would do that. Back at camp, I spent the rest of the day fishing in a nearby creek. The water was icy, but I managed to catch a couple of trout, which I cooked over the fire for dinner. As the sun set, the unease from the night before returned, stronger this time. The woods seemed too quiet. That night I heard footsteps. It started as faint crunching, like something walking through the underbrush. At first, I thought it was an animal again, but the steps were too deliberate, too heavy. They circled the tent slowly, pausing every so often. My heart pounded as I gripped the knife I kept by my sleeping bag. The footsteps eventually stopped, and I stayed awake for hours, listening to every creak and rustle outside. By morning, I was exhausted but determined to figure out what was going on. I found tracks around the tent, large, boot-shaped impressions. Someone had definitely been out there during the night. My first instinct was to pack up and leave, but something held me back. Maybe it was curiosity or stubbornness, but I decided to stay one more night. I spent the day exploring further from camp, trying to shake off the tension. About a mile away, I stumbled upon an old cabin. It was small and looked like it hadn't been used in decades. The windows were shattered, and the door hung off its hinges. Inside, I found more signs of recent activity. A makeshift bed made of blankets, empty food cans, and a fire pit with ashes that couldn't have been more than a few days old. Whoever had been staying here wasn't far away. I left the cabin quickly and made my way back to camp. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, but as the sun dipped below the horizon, the unease returned. I kept the fire burning high and stayed outside the tent, watching the tree line. Around midnight, the footsteps came back. This time, they didn't circle the tent. They stopped just beyond the firelight. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel the presence. Someone or something was there, just out of reach. I called out, but there was no response, only the sound of breathing. I didn't sleep that night. By dawn, I had made up my mind to leave. I packed up camp quickly, constantly glancing over my shoulder. As I loaded the last of my gear into the truck, I heard it, a low whistle, coming from the trees. I froze. The whistle came again, closer this time. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but something made me look. Just for a moment, standing at the edge of the clearing was a man. He was tall and wiry, wearing torn clothes and a blank expression. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there watching. I didn't wait to find out what he wanted. I jumped into the truck and sped down the dirt path, not stopping until I reached the nearest town hours later. I told the local sheriff about what I'd seen, but they didn't seem concerned. Probably just a drifter, they said. Plenty of them out in these parts. But it didn't feel like that. Whoever or whatever that man was, he wasn't just a drifter. To this day, I can't explain what happened out there. I haven't been camping since. Sometimes, late at night, I hear that whistle in my dreams. And every time, I wake up with the same feeling I had in those woods, that I'm being watched. It was late September when my husband, Brian, suggested we go camping. He was a cop, and with his unpredictable work schedule, we rarely had time for trips together. I'd been craving some peace and quiet away from the city, so I agreed. We planned to camp in the Blue Ridge Mountains, a spot far enough from the city, but close enough to drive home if anything went wrong. We chose a campsite a few hours away that Brian had visited during a training exercise years ago. It wasn't a well-known spot, which we thought was perfect. Fewer people meant more privacy. The campground was tucked deep in the woods, accessible only by a single gravel road that snaked through miles of forest. We left early Friday morning. The drive was serene, with the leaves turning shades of orange and red. The crisp air carried a hint of winter, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of calm. Brian was in a good mood, chatting about the fishing gear he'd packed and how we'd roast marshmallows by the fire. When we arrived, the campsite was nearly empty. There were only 2 other cars in the lot, and their owners were nowhere to be seen. The area was quiet except for the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant chirping of birds. We picked a spot near a small stream, far from the other campsites. The stream bubbled gently, and the sound was soothing. Brian set up the tent while I gathered firewood. The chill in the air was sharper in the shade of the trees, but it wasn't unpleasant. By late afternoon, we'd settled in. The fire was crackling, and Brian was unpacking our small portable grill. We planned to stay for 2 nights, enjoying the solitude and each other's company. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the woods grew darker and quieter. The first night was uneventful. We talked by the fire until it burned down to embers and then crawled into our sleeping bags. The tent was cozy, and the sound of the stream lulled me to sleep. The next morning, we woke to a clear, cold day. Brian wanted to fish in the stream, so I decided to explore the woods nearby. I told him I'd stick close to the campsite and not wander too far. The forest felt different in the daylight. The tall trees formed a canopy overhead, and the ground was littered with fallen leaves. I followed a narrow trail that seemed to lead uphill. It wasn't marked, but it looked like it had been used before. After about an hour, I came across something that made me stop. It was an old, dilapidated cabin hidden among the trees. The roof had caved in on one side, and the wooden walls were weathered and covered in moss. It didn't look like anyone had been there in years. Curious, I stepped closer. The door hung crooked on its hinges, and the windows were shattered. I peered inside but saw nothing but broken furniture and debris. Still, the sight of it made me uneasy. I decided to head back to the campsite. When I returned, Brian was gutting a fish he'd caught. I told him about the cabin, but he just shrugged it off. "Probably an old hunting lodge," he said, not looking up from his work. That night, the atmosphere felt different. The forest was unnaturally quiet, and the temperature had dropped significantly. We sat by the fire, but neither of us spoke much. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. As we were getting ready to sleep, I heard something. It was faint at first, a rustling sound coming from the direction of the woods. I froze and strained my ears. Could have been an animal, but it didn't sound like one. Brian must have heard it too because he stepped out of the tent and scanned the area with his flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there. "Probably just the wind," he said, though his tone was less certain than before. We went back into the tent, but I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing that sound, like someone or something was moving just outside our campsite. Around midnight, Brian's radio crackled to life. He'd brought it along in case of emergencies. The static was loud and sudden, making both of us jump. Then we heard it. A voice, faint and garbled, like it was struggling to come through. "Help! Lost!" Brian grabbed the radio and tried to respond, but there was no reply. The voice had been faint, but it sounded close. "We need to check it out," Brian said, grabbing his flashlight and gun. I didn't want to leave the tent, but I also didn't want him going alone. We followed the direction of the sound, moving cautiously through the dark woods. The beam of Brian's flashlight cut through the shadows, but the trees loomed tall and menacing. After about 10 minutes, we found a backpack lying on the ground. It looked old and weathered, like it had been there for months. Brian searched it but found nothing that could identify the owner. That's when we heard it again, a faint voice calling for help. This time it was closer. We moved toward the sound, but as we did, the air grew colder and the forest seemed darker. We reached a clearing, and that's when we saw it. A second tent, half collapsed, with its contents scattered around. It looked like it had been abandoned in a hurry. There were no signs of anyone nearby, just the eerie silence of the woods. Brian searched the tent while I kept watch. Inside, he found more camping gear, but no ID or anything to explain who had been there. Then we heard it again. The voice was louder this time, but it sounded wrong. Distorted, like it was being played through a broken speaker. Brian's face was pale as he stepped out of the tent. "We're going back," he said firmly. We hurried back to our campsite, and neither of us spoke. Once we were inside the tent, Brian locked the zippers and kept his gun within reach. That night, I barely slept. The sounds outside continued, rustling, faint footsteps, and that voice, always distant but never gone. When morning finally came, we packed up and left without a word. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd been watched the entire time. I never told Brian, but as we passed the gravel road leading back to the campsite, I thought I saw someone standing at the edge of the trees, watching us leave.